into a couple of things that go into your assessment for process, which is your attendance. So I take a screenshot to keep my records up to date of that. Although I have to look at who the 7 others are, because you don't all fit in the screen. And then I also record absences and excuses, and who does assignments. So if you have an assignment that's a set, there'll only be a few, like 6 or so across the term. You're still required to do them, and it's preparatory homework, as well as the reading. And this system tracks your reading and editing. For now, though, I'm going to continue with my lecture, and well, part of it, which is an update to something that you might have heard some parts of before, but not that much of it. All right, so I'm still talking about what happened after September 11 and the newspaper response. And this one is a collection of images around COVID and how the COVID era is, well, I'm calling it an era. It might not be an era. It might just be a blip. It might finish next year. Hooray. Although, you know, that's what we also said in the first months. The headlines for the COVID were not that different to the war, terror, September 11 headline. We didn't have an exploding building, but we have a man in a mask, but we have the word explode, and we have the metaphor of war. Like it's a war on the vaccine, or not a war on the vaccine, war on the virus. And you know, like the best ideological wars, this enemy is invisible, although it's not completely. Some of these headlines are fantastic. Look at the one on business that talks about World War V. World War V, is that? That would make the Cold War the 4th war, and then the war on terror, Cold War the 3rd war. The war on terror would be the 4th war, and the 5th war would be the war on virus. Or it's V for virus. In some way, they're also channeling the sci-fi show V, and V for Vendetta, and so EU vaccine war explodes. Now, how do they force the metaphor of explosion into the news? Don't start a vaccine war. Trump saying war on COVID-19. EU vaccine war, use that twice. China continues to shine in global war against COVID-19. Now, so I'm thinking, okay, so why the war metaphor, and what's at stake here? And really, because I was thinking of that stuff in a previous lecture where, if you remember, I talked about Charlie Hebdo, right, and representation of Islam through cartoons, and the offense that was done when the cartoons were used as a weapon because of that attack on Charlie Hebdo, the journalists, because they published insulting, the Danish newspaper published 6 Muhammad cartoons in 2005, which insulted the Prophet, blessed be his name, and was intentional. And that was framed in terms of discussion of freedom of press, right? The Jyllands-Posten published the cartoons, and it fitted into a freedom of expression, freedom of press. Well, freedom of the press is very different to freedom of speech, I want to say, first of all. But that's, if you remember, I spoke about this a couple of years ago to you, if you were in that class. What was the course called? Culture in the World. Okay, of course it's similar to mass media and culture. I want to suggest that this battle over freedom of speech is quite an old one and always a bit political or biased. Salman Rushdie and the fatwa against the Khomeini regime, the fatwa of the Khomeini regime against the Satanic Verses in 1988, which caused booksellers to be targeted, attacked, and sometimes killed. Booksellers, people who sell books, right? They should be sacred to us, but some of them were killed, partly because this Satanic Verses fatwa got so much publicity. But of course, there's been censorship on all sides. The censorship of the Beatles in Texas, they were burning Beatles paraphernalia because they were, dangerous. The Beatles were dangerous. Can you believe it? Rock and roll was going to corrupt young families. The daughters of families would rush out and sleep with John, Paul, George, and Ringo. In the 50s, D.H. Lawrence's book, Lady Chatterley's Lover, because it was a book about sex, was controversial. William Burroughs' book, The Naked Lunch, because it was about sex and drugs, was a big. Go back even further, the 1920s. So from culture being in the news, right, the news press, we have everything from fake news these days, and in some senses, I think that's a summer distraction. So I'm back to wider culture wars, editorial, war propaganda, and so on. And Charlie Hebdo was a part of that war propaganda, right? And yeah, it was terrible that in 2015, 11 people from Charlie Hebdo were killed because they'd mocked the prophet. Emmanuel Macron recently, just last year, had, and this is the new stuff, had added to this controversy by saying that he understood Muslim feelings about the prophet. And so we're getting to the end of the anti-Islam war in a way. We can understand Muslim feelings. We're a bit more sensitive now. And so even though the French government in the same week had labeled as Islamic terror incident where a man with an axe, a meat cleaver actually, attacked a couple of people nearby the Charlie Hebdo offices. And Macron then used that, Now we can go back and talk about the clash of cultures and critique of Samuel Huntington. He died last year as well. The biker rallies, the anti-cartoon, the anti-Muhammad cartoon competitions, and both sides. Or we could talk about, I know this censorship on both sides, and Christian fundamentalism is a part of it, and I'm terrified of Christian fundamentalists in America, right? George Bush thinking that God wants him to be a sunbeam, and he's got his hand on a nuclear button, was a terrifying thought. But this seemed like just fake news or journalism or a distraction, because at the very same time, millions were being killed in wars. So while these images are you can laugh and you can say this is going on, and the bikers were mobilizing, and so what all this really was supporting was similar to today. The unspoken background is that war is business, and that's going on, right? You see the link here, the Rosie the Riveter with her muscles, right? But she's now wearing a mask. That's a World War II war propaganda poster too. And World War II, in a way, was the last war that was okay to fight because it was against fascism. And subsequently, America's been on the wrong side of ethics and morals. But why do I think that we should be talking about, I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about COVID, but to call COVID a war, I mean, somehow we're not talking about one of the greatest scourges that's ongoing in our globe is continuing wars. And sure, Afghanistan has seen the departure of the US soldiers, but we haven't seen the departure of war from there, and certainly the business of war, which is why I wanted to just spend a little bit of time picking up some of the factual information from the arms trade to contrast this kind of rhetoric and imagery, which is all well and good, and I mean, we can examine it and we should examine it and we should analyze it and so on, but always remember that the background to this is a massive investment in the industry of weaponry. The manufacture of weapons is big business, and it has been for hundreds of years. In fact, without the gun, without armaments, colonialism could not have imposed its will on India and Southeast Asia, on the Americas. The American continent was colonized by the six-shooter, right? And we tell nice stories and make movies about cowboys and Indians, but that's really the colonization process, the extermination of indigenous land. Sure, they had bows and arrows and so on. I mean, that was dangerous, but the winners had guns, and people sold the guns and found it a profitable industry. Okay, Watling was the family that they were Quakers of all things. Spent 100 years or more profiting from the business of making guns near Birmingham. Actually, eventually the Quakers said it's ethically wrong and you shouldn't do it, and they pulled out of that, pulled back from that, not out completely, but pulled back from making guns. But the British state did not, and the United States did not. Look at these numbers. Top 10 military spenders of weaponry, and put this into perspective, right? The bailout for the 2008 economic crisis, the big, the depression of our era, the biggest collapse of banking, that was 300 billion. And that was over a period of 10 years. Annually, the United States spends 778 billion in the arms industry, in its military spending, right? And then the next biggest is China, 252. Russia, 61 billion, right? So big chunks of their economy. I've got a scale for, this is last year, right? Military spending, and this is not given as a percentage of their overall budget. It shows them the changes. So US military spending has gone up 6% from 2019, right? Up 6% of 778 billion, that's about 70 billion. That's some country's whole economy. China, 252, gone down 3%, which is interesting. India up 2.5, Russia down 5%. The United Kingdom up 21%. Now, the United Kingdom had a conservative government for a number of years now, a long time since Labor got kicked out. We're looking at 2012, 10 years nearly, getting onto a decade. So it's no surprise that they've managed to kick in with the military expenditure, but not that the Labor Party didn't also. Saudi Arabia reduced 7%, Germany increased by 7%, France increased by 5%, Japan by 3% up, and South Korea by 4% up. You can see some regions are becoming more spiky. They're spending more on military, others are not. But by far and away, the biggest is the US. Its military spend per year is like more than the top 10 altogether. Now, the UK is the fourth largest supplier of military equipment for the world, and that's just a 5% share. France, 88% share. Russia, 17% share, 44%. The thing is that the United Kingdom sells, the British sell to problematic countries, right? Like Saudi Arabia, countries that are at war. They were selling weapons to Indonesia when Indonesia was putting down insurgency in its own country and using British weapons to do so. In the Sudan, in Sierra Leone, in many places, right? And it doesn't matter whether it's Labour or Conservative. There's huge trade investment and support from members of the British states for selling off their weapons of mass destruction. Right? The very things that they went to war in Iraq, over are the things that they have their leaders, previous British Prime Minister Cameron, here photographed in Saudi Arabia by King Abdullah, giving him an award, or Prince Charles, Bonnie Prince Charles, dressed up as a warrior of, like, at the same time as you have an anti-Islamic ideology, a demonization of figures like Saddam, we have the prince dressed up almost in pantomime as a sheikh with his gold sword and so on, all in the interest really of British business, selling weapons to. Here's a letter that's produced by Boris Johnson just a couple of years ago to justify continuing to sell British weapons in the Yemen, which is an ongoing war zone. The British are profiting from a civil war that is brutal, and without doubt, the selling of weapons in that situation inflames. It's criminal, what it is. Now, they say that they have a robust evidence-based process to reach their own conclusions as to whether or not it's legitimate to spend military equipment, send them to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is using it in the Yemen. But honestly, I can't even speak about this. This is close up for the letter. I don't know if it's good enough for you to read yet. Small enough for you to read. But look, we regularly raise the importance of compliance with international humanitarian law. Compliance with what? I mean, you'll not use the weapons. They've got a case-by-case assessment of export licenses. Right? So Saudi is using the weapons in the Yemen. The Yemen is this is like another example was when Australia sold Iroquois helicopter gunships to the Papua New Guinea government in the 1990s. And they said, we know that you're having this war with the secessionists in Bougainville, but we're selling you these helicopter gunships, and you've got to promise us not to use them. But because we don't really trust you, we're going to take the machine guns out of them. So they sold the helicopter gunships without the guns. And there are photographs of this. I should have got one of the mountings for the machine guns. There's open helicopters, like you've seen Huey helicopter, basically. Iroquois is an updated version. They're open. You have guys sitting on the helicopter with a mounted machine gun shooting people down below. And these mounted machine guns were taken away, so you only could see the mounts. And the genius of the Papua New Guinean government, the defense forces, they used rope to tie the machine guns back on so they could still continue to use them in the suppression of the Bougainville people. I mean, Australia could then claim to have asked them not to use the weapons, and I can't even begin to describe the hypocrisy of that. And the worst thing is that this news story, is smothered, and because it takes a little bit of reading, you've got to read through the lines of the letter. You've got to keep track of things over time, and remember that this that happened in 2015 is still going on in 2020, and so and worse, the Afghan situation. You need to have a long historical memory as well, and go back to even 1844, the first British invasion, and remember that they were defeated in Afghanistan as well, because the Afghans, they're fighters, and they will repel people who invade their country. No surprise there. And the introduction of weapons, ever more crazy rocket. Destructive rockets and smart weapons. Sorry, I forgot we were talking about smart weapons as well. Into this situation should be the kind of thing that gets headline news and is on the front page, but because it's not presented in terms of explosions and the word war, right? Instead, we have these ideological imageries of Muslims and things we can laugh at, kept inside the box, inside the frame in the newspaper, or in you don't get cartoons on the CNN TV news that much, but certainly kept in a box and in the press and in the TV news. Gaddafi's execution is used as wallpaper for another story, and the story of how we make the news is more important than the content of the news. So that it's our responsibility to always be wanting to dig deeper into these stories. I'm gonna stop talking about Charlie Hebdo, but think about the military side of things, the arms trade. One image that I used there was the one of the spending, military spending. And I got this from a very interesting website. Okay, I'm sharing the website now, and it's Visual Capitalist, right? And I find this one really interesting. I might have, I've shown people this in other courses. I don't think that you've seen it yet. This is from May 15th this year, 2021, right? A guy called Aaron Ali. But this website does some, like, a thing every day. Quite often, it's very pro-business. Like, who's spending the most on social programs or something like that, propaganda. But sometimes there's a real critical one, and that's essential. And this one, you see top 10 military spenders, all the handy info. Although in this map, military spending as a share of GDP, more than 5% is all the dark blue. The brown, which includes Vietnam, is we don't have any information about it. They got no data. And now you can get that data and work it out. But, well, I assume you can for these countries, but they didn't have for this one. But, there's expenditure by region. And this graph, for all the COVID graphs we're getting, at the same time, this graph going up, if that was a COVID graph, we'd be heading to lockdown. But what it means is we're heading to more and more weapons in the world, like a objective, massive increase from 30 years ago. Not so big an increase from 10 years ago, but still an increase in the last 20 years. So from the beginning of what we started with today, the war on terror, from the September 11, 2001 attack, a nearly double increase in the money spent on weaponry. Not on education, not on communications, not on health. I mean, we'll see what happens with spending for COVID, if that changes. Not on the environment, and so on. Now, here's their other topics. So I will put the link up for this website onto e-learning because I think it's really good. You can, but some of it is from the other side, right? The top 10 top-selling vehicles in America, the biggest public companies, that's of interest, how to invest in the chip tech industry, or defense spending, right? How much NATO countries spend in defense. This one's pretty interesting because look at the graphic. The page of the graphic shows Europe, right? And it says NATO countries, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and 73 billion spent by the United Kingdom, 65 billion spent by Germany, and so this is for 2020, right? And the thing that this graphic doesn't quite give you in terms of its presentation, even though it's like presented as just the facts and not advertising. I mean, you don't see the US straight away, right? You look at the top of the graphic, defense spending of NATO countries. Remember that the US is a NATO country, North Atlantic Treaty, and it starts with 2, the United Kingdom. So number 1 must be the US. Where are they? They're not in this list. They're not even on the map. So the North Atlantic is out here, off to the side. The US is down here. US and Canada, number 1, 24%, 811 billion, compared to 73 billion of Canada, right? So of the 1.2 trillion, 3/4 of it is spent by the United States. Now, this is spending is not it's not like you and I going to the shop and spending money. We buy products and consume them. This is investment on the part of the US. They're putting 811 billion into the industry and making money from it. It's a business for them. The selling of weapons, they're not spending like buying weaponry. They're in business. So it's a very hugely profitable industry. But again, they show this is the conservative nature of this site. You've got to be careful with it. United States, 811. Change in the last 7 years, 24%. That's change in the last 7 years. It's not that it's 24% of all spending. In fact, if you work it out, they spend 24% of the this is the increase. It's increased 24%, but they spend 811 out of 1.2. So they have control of 65 to 70% of the budget. Anyway, there are other things in this site that are worth looking at. This one, Map Explainer about Afghanistan. That's the last one I'll look at today. I want to get a better image of this. Continue reading. Okay. So it gives you Afghanistan. It doesn't go into much of the history, but we've got the Soviet-Afghan War. It doesn't go back to 1844 when the British first invade, but you can read William Dalrymple's amazing book, Return of a King, which documents from historical material the complete defeat of the British Army in 1844 in Afghanistan. Their slaughter, basically. long. I'll get you for your question a bit later. So the image here is contemporary, I suppose. They're not going back into too much history, but it's good to see just where and what's going on in what we hear, right? So we hear a lot about Jalalabad and Ghazni, Kabul, the Kabul River, right, and so on. And we see that these Kabul and these Jalalabad places are very close to the Pakistan border. Kandahar as well, because the Pakistan border is down here, right? And places like where there was a lot of trouble, Mazari Sharif, Herat, especially from the Taliban, are quite far from this capital. They're right out in the mountains, in the remote Farah and Lashkar, Kandahar, right? They're far from Kabul. They're in the opium growing areas of Helmand province, right? The center of opium production, major revenue source for the Taliban. Interestingly, because originally opium was brought to this region by the East India Company, the British East India Company, who started to cultivate, get Indian farmers to replace their rice crop with opium, which was then, brought to China and Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, in his Declaration of Independence in 1945, pointed out that the French had forced the opium use upon as a way to keep Vietnamese workers docile, working. And yeah, these maps are very interesting and useful shorthand presentations of material that are called map explainers, right? They are like useful background to the news stories that we keep on being presented by our television. Where do people live in Afghanistan? That's a very strange looking map. Okay, I mean, they've moved Kabul from this side here into this and made it look like a bug. Does it look like a bit like a fly or something? They call it a cartogram. And Herat has shrunk. Kandahar is sort of, these look like eyes of a fly, don't you think? Anyway, maps are amazing. I find them very, very interesting. I'm going to stop for now, okay? But I will give you the link. So there's a lot to be learnt about Afghanistan just from these small presentations. Of course, you should also read Vijay Prasad's book, The Fifth Afghan War, and I'll put a link up to that as well. It's important. Vijay Prasad's coming in December he's going to speak online to us at the conference, ISSH 2021 in December. What I'm trying to do is stop the recording. All right, so we can have some question time before we end today.